In this video, I've got 10 tips of how you can be successful at your next NHS jobs. Let's get into it. First tip is you need to understand the process. And when I say that, I mean, is it just an interview? Is it just a panel interview? Do you have a stakeholder panel? Do you have a presentation to do? Because understanding what the process is will help you to do the next step. In this. But also, what I've learned recently is that, especially when you go for higher bandings in the NHS, some of the recruitment's done by a recruitment agency. So there's a stepped process even before you get to the shortlist of the shortlist. Then you get to the panel. So I recently took on an associate NED role in an NHS trust, and this was via a recruitment agency. So I had to write a CV and a personal statement. Then I had a preliminary conversation with the recruiter, who then took that information over to the trust, who then decided whether or not I got through to the next stage. So that's why I say it's very important to understand the process. And I think as you go up the bandings in NHS, it will get different. So from band 5 to 7, I think most of the times, the ones I've been for, it's either a presentation and an interview panel. I know from band 8 and above, they've either been stakeholder panels. They've also been psychometric type tests as well as like I'd mentioned, stakeholder panels and the interview panels. So it's really important that you're clear about it, because it helps with step number 2 in terms of preparation. So step 2 is about the prep. So you need to read appropriately for any job that you're applying for. And when I say read appropriately, again, if you're applying for a band 5 to 7 role, there might be certain things that you need to know. Things such as, I think, what the trust strategy is, what their direction of travel is, maybe even what their last CQC report, especially if you're going to be working in a ward, in a community team, or with a different groups of team. You would need to know things like that, because there might be improvements that you need to make in that role. As you go higher up in the NHS, you have to broaden your readings. You might look at the board papers. And again, I'm not asking you to look at the last 20 or so years of the board papers, but you might want to look at the last 2 to 3 board reports, and within that you'll find the trust strategy. You might also find where they are with that, things around their CQC plan. Do they do quality improvement work? So when you're reading appropriately, it's thinking about looking at the job description, the job spec that you're going for, and thinking about what might be useful in terms of your reading. It's always important also to know what's going on, not only internally but externally. So you look at government policies, so whether that is the new NHS long-term plan, the integrated care systems, think about which integrated care system that you're working in and what their place strategy is. So there's usually a health and well-being plan for each, what used to be the borough or place that you're working with. So again, understanding what your role needs to do around that. I work in mental health, I work in with secondary care, but it's really important that we work with our primary care colleagues or GPs. So again, if I was going for a role at my level, I'll be thinking about what are we doing around things like that. For example, there was the more recent Fuller report. So again, it's really understanding the job you're going for, the job spec, and then think about how you prepare for that and how it links into that interview process. The third bit is thinking about what trust or where you're working is looked at externally. And I did mention in the previous tip around things like the Care Quality Commission report, or there might be, and I mentioned the integrated care system, they might have their more recent board reports or reviews of things that they've gone around to see in the team. So it's really good to get an internal and external perspective, because again, it's things that you could bring into that interview process to support you with ensuring that you're successful at that interview. Tip 4, and if you've watched my videos, you would have seen, I've mentioned this before, is thinking about potential questions that you might be asked, and writing them down and anticipating them. So you'd expect to be asked things like, why have you applied for this job? Maybe your leadership style, what are some of your strengths and weaknesses? Why this job? Why now? But also there might be other questions that you wouldn't think of. And I remember going for a head of nursing role, or is it associate head of nursing role many years ago, and it was almost a 3-part process. So the first process was that we had to read an article and come up with a plan, and then we had to feed it back. And in the afternoon, and if we got through that, then we got to the interview process in the afternoon. And one of the questions I remember being asked, which I hadn't even thought of, I hadn't even prepared for, was how did I think the process went, and how did I think my the other people in the process, what their view of me was. And I think that really knocked me sideways, because it hadn't been something that I had thought of or anticipated. So in tip 4, it's really important that you anticipate the questions that always come, but also things that you haven't really thought of. But one of the ways of doing this is looking at the job description, understanding the process that's going to come up, because it will help you to prepare for it. You're not going to be able to prepare for everything, but by anticipating some things, it helps you to put your best foot forward, put the best you forward that you can do. Tip 5, so once you've anticipated the questions, it's really important that you prepare some answers. And tip 5 leads into tip 6. So tip 5 is around, when you're preparing answers, you might want to, for the questions that you thought of, make some bullet points in terms of potential answers for them. And when you're sort of doing that, think about your past experiences, things that you've done, some of the results you've had. If reflecting on what happened, if it happened again, what would you do differently? Or would you do anything differently? What have you learned? That then leads into tip 6, which is about actually practicing the answers. And here I'm doing a video, which I take lots of practice on. I'm still getting better at it. But what I want you to do is practice saying your answers out loud, practice them in the mirror, but also, if you can, record them. Because what it's going to help you do is see things that you do normally, it just becomes part and parcel of what you do. So I remember being told in the past that I used to play with my hair a lot, and what that then gave off to people in the room, or people was watching, was I might be nervous or unsure of myself, and it doesn't really put a lot of confidence into the person watching or listening. So now you'd see that my hair's back. I'm going for interview. I'm aware that, I do fiddle, I do play with my hair, so I'll make sure that my hair is in a hairstyle that I can't play with. I'll be aware that I do talk a lot with my hands, which is fine. It's good to be animated, it's good to do things like that. But I try and minimize that a lot so I can put my best self forward. Also, because I've done acting as part of RADA course, which again, it reminds you about your stance, how your presence, how you come across, like especially we do a lot of video interviews at the moment. So again, it's thinking about how making sure your setup's right, you've got the right lighting, that you can be seen and heard. So it's really important that you practice. Two things with practicing is, I'd say, try and get your answers to 2 to 3 minutes if possible. And the reason I say this, I've been to a number of interviews, being on both sides, being interviewed as well as interviewing people, where we've got a very tight schedule and very tight questions. So I've often been told I've got 8 or so questions and 45 minutes to answer them in, or 9 questions and 45 minutes to answer them in, and it's up to me to manage my time. But it's very important that whatever your answer is, you can try and get it to be as succinct as possible, 2 to 3 minutes, because there might be a time pressure in terms of the interview as well. And what you want to do is ensure that you get your answers, your stories really clear, concise and across to the people listening in a timely manner, so that you can answer all the questions in that interview. And in one of my other interviews, I've sort of talked about the CAR methodology, and there's the STAR methodology. And I know people add an extra E on, which is around evaluation. So it's thinking about the context, the actions you took, your results, and your evaluation of it. So your reflection of what went well, what didn't, what would you do differently if that came around. So if you're able to put that into 2 minutes, that will be really, really helpful. And the last bit is try and put a smile and some energy with your answers as well, because it really conveys a feeling to the interview viewer that you're somebody who's enthusiastic, really energetic, ready to go. So it's really important that you sort of land all of that. And like I say, I did RADA, and you have to think of, the way I think about it, it's a bit of a performance, an interview. You know, you want to come across really knowledgeable and skilled, but you also want to come across as a likable person who people can work with and who people can get along with. So you want to put that killer smile in whatever you say, like I'm doing now. So tip number 7, and I haven't said it before, but when you do get that letter to say you've got an interview on X date, or even before that, always say to you, do speak to the recruiter. So when you do get the interview letter, it will tell you the time, the date for the interview. Make sure you note that down. But this little tip is around having a little research of the people who will be on the panel. So again, that goes back to the process. Is it going to be a stakeholder panel? Is it going to be is it going to be a presentation? Is it just going to be an interview? And that would help you in thinking about what those people's interests are, because you can look at their LinkedIn, their Twitter, if they've got a Twitter handle, social media type thing. Those two are the key ones, because then you'll see what they're tweeting about. You'll see what they like or what they put on their LinkedIn feeds. It gives you an idea of their The next one is for the interview itself, and it's tip number 8, and that is, and I've said it time and time again, an interview is not a memory test. It is not a memory test, and I'm going to say it again, it is not a memory test. You can take stuff into the interview, just let the interviewees know what you're taking in. I always suggest to people I work with to take a pen and paper, because I always suggest when you get a question, it's, you know, what you really want to do is jump in and start answering. But what's helpful is to pause, think, and by having a pen and paper, you can maybe write down the question, or maybe write some of the things that you'd want to say to answer that question. So it helps you to engage your brains and your thoughts. That some people also take summary of things that they'd want to impart in the interview. One person even suggested that they had a 100-day plan that they drafted if they were successful, but again, wouldn't necessarily leave that with the interviewers, because they'd have to weigh up the pros and the cons of doing that. What I'm saying is, you can take a summary. I normally read my personal statement before I go into an interview. I always have it in my bag, because it's not a memory test, and you might want to, you know, go back over some things that you've done, so that you can feed that back to the interviewer. Tip 9, and it's the tip about at the end of the interview, and again, it's a two-way process, in that they're interviewing you to find out if you're suitable for their team, their organization, but you should also see it as you interviewing them to see, do you want to work for this team, this organization? And this is where at the end of the interview, you've got chance to ask questions, and I normally say prepare about 1 or 2. What I don't want you to do is ask, when will I find out? What's the salary? You know, things that you don't ask, questions that you could have researched about, or if you had a conversation with a recruiter, you could have asked these questions. You might still be in your mind thinking, is this really the right fit for me? So this is where you take the opportunity to ask questions that would help you answer those questions in your mind where you're not sure. So make sure you prepare 1 to 2 questions, and make sure it's a question that you really need answered, that you've done all your research, your conversations, that hasn't come up. I always think it's an opportunity that's too good to be missed, but also it's still part of the interview process. It gives you that extra opportunity to give a good impression to your potential employer. And tip 10, not everybody does it, but it's something that you might want to think about, and it's sending a thank you message to the interviewers panel to say thank you for the interview process. And what this potentially does is help you to stand out to the interviewers. Both it's a nice thing to do. So it's a tip that you can take or leave, but potentially one that really couldn't. And the final tip or bonus is number 11. Something I guess people don't really think of. So it's when you get the phone call to let you know if you have or haven't been successful at the interview. And if you haven't, it's really sad. And I always think it's good to think about how you respond to not getting the job, but also it's an opportunity for you to get some feedback, to understand what you did well, what you didn't do so well, what you would need to do differently. I always suggest that you don't ask for feedback on that call, because it's not great being told that you haven't been successful at something. However, and I don't think you'd be in the right state of mind to take anything in at that time, but I would suggest that you ask to have half an hour or so with the interviewer to get that feedback on what you can improve, what you can do differently. I always think that's really helpful. It's part of your own development. And secondly, in terms of asking for that time, I think it's incumbent on you to follow up and ensure that time's agreed. I do know that from speaking to colleagues that they haven't always been successful in the person setting up time, but where I have done it, I've always found it really helpful for me, and people have made the time to feedback, and that's always helped me in terms of future interviews, etc. The second bit is, if you do get that you've been successful at interview, which is what you really want to hear, it's for you to really think or really know, are you going to accept the role? And if there are things that you'd want to clarify before you accept the role. If you're applying for an NHS job, the things that you're unable to negotiate on is things such as your pay, annual leave, because they're all agreed by the agenda for change. However, you may not have asked about flexible working during the interview, and this is a time to ask about that. But it's really important that you think about, what you do when you get that telephone call, what actions you need to take. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Let's be bold and brave together. My next video, I am going to do a step-by-step guide of how you can apply it on the NHS Jobs website for a job. And I really want to give you a step-by-step guide in showing practically how that is done. So if that's something that you want to see, have a look on my other one. If you know how to do that already, do feel free to have a look at some of my other videos that I've done, and I'll see you on the next one. Let's be bold and brave together. Bye.